Okay, I think that we can start because it's 3-4 actually. So, first of all, welcome everyone to the second episode of this kind of talk show on influencer law, but especially for the book. Actually, the book launch that Sofia actually and Catalina edited, and it was quite interesting to have you here for the second episode. And today, as you know quite well, we'll try to have an informal conversation just to understand what are the primary challenges and also opportunities in this kind of new field of law at the intersection between consumer law, public law, contract law, and very different fields of law. So the idea is to have a second kind of discussion because we have another one in the weeks before about actually the, let's say, the private side of influencer marketing. So in this time we'll try to focus a little bit more on the public law side of the influencer marketing, and not just public law side but also the social effects of influencer marketing, the ethical concern, and the challenges also for our legal system. So, and I'm so excited and happy, and especially I think that Sofia can agree with me, to have all of you here with us to start this conversation. So I would say thank you so much to be here once again, and I will leave the floor to Sofia also to share this kind of enthusiasm for this kind of second episode, and then we can start our discussion together.
Well, thank you so much for starting, Giovanni. So first of all, I have a terrible noise on the background because they are rebuilding my house. I hope you can still understand me, but I had to sit outside because of that. So I'm really sorry, but I did my best. So thank you very much for being here. So I'd like to start by introducing you, because I don't think everyone knows the authors of our great book. So the book has been out for now about 1 month, 2 months. And the book is a very interesting project because it is the first book to talk about the regulation of social media influencers from different perspectives. So you see quite a lot of shows, quite a lot of investigative journalism that is trying to delve into the problem, but very often they don't actually specify what the legal limitations are. So today we have a number of authors with us, and I'm going to start to introduce them one by one. So one of them that I see her on my left side of the screen, is Marijke de Veerman. Marijke is a PhD candidate at the University of Ghent, and she also is a lecturer at the same university. She has delivered a terrific chapter together with Steffi Dians, Elizabeth Den Avila, and Lieselot Huurders. And their chapter is actually quite a deep study on teenage influencers, and I think it's a really great contribution to the literature. We also have Isabel Ebert with us. She's on my right side of the screen. Isabel is a research associate and PhD candidate at the University of St. Gallen. Together with Dana Sinderman, she wrote a chapter on business ethics. So she provided an ethical perspective on influencer marketing. And I believe I just saw on social media that she got like a new appointment, which maybe she will talk about later. We have, I'm just following my screen. We have Monica Lucinska. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. Monica is a professor at Maastricht University, and together with Gijs van Dijk, she wrote a really interesting chapter that actually tries to draw us to the importance of empirical legal studies. That is also her field of study. And I think it's really important that we also talk about the importance of conducting empirical studies, and also the validity of certain research methods that are being used to study research methods, influencer marketing. And then last but certainly not least, we have Simona van der Hoop, a professor at Leiden University, put together with Valerie Verdoot and Mark Leiser, also colleagues at Leiden, wrote a really interesting chapter on children influencers, and actually on how these commercial activities, can actually insert themselves or not in the discussion on children's rights. So my name is Sofia Jordaas, and I am professor at the University of Groningen. Giovanni, you has already introduced himself. He's a PhD candidate at the University and lecturer at Bukhara University. And I see that we have some guests. I know two of them. I know Jeroen, because he's my student. So hi, Jeroen. And I also know Maïse Marx. The idea is to have a talk show, basically. So we're going to ask questions to our speakers. but also anyone can just like ask a question. You can raise your hands as you see on your the right side of the screen, and then we can just see this as really as a talk show and to just discuss the problems of legal implications of influencers. So Giovanni, you have the floor again.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I have just my mic to unmute. Okay. Thanks a lot. What I will try to do now, probably just. Of course, Sophia, have already introduced basically your chapter, but just to have probably would be good, just even to before to discuss, even if let's say we can have a roundtable just between us, since probably as Sophia said, we actually do not know each other so well. So if any one of us can show our views on especially your contribution and the influencer marketing, especially from your perspective, in just 1 minute and a half, just to frame the topic, and then we'll start to focus on one side of the other side of the topic. So Isabel, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. First of all, yeah, congratulations on the book being out. That's really a great achievement. I think it was an interesting discussion we had on the various panels also that where we met in person, and very enlightening. But basically, of course, I'm sort of the a paradise bird in the room between all the lawyers as a business ethicist. So basically, our chapter sort of opened the black box of influencer marketing from an ethical perspective, that being ethics goes often beyond what the current law requires. And we were sort of trying to build a consensus of what sort of ethical behavior could look like in influencer marketing. And one of the propositions that we came up with is that the influencers need to take a bit of a closer look on the actual product that they're endorsing and sort of the company that is producing it, sort of assessing the manufacturing conditions, but also looking at potential harm against the influencers during the consumption, or when you sort of transform that whole thing in the health sector. There was a lot of misinformation on Instagram, for example, about COVID-19 as well. So in a certain sense, as an influencer, you have a certain political responsibility not to spread misinformation, and at the same time also not to endorse products that can be harmful for the health of the consumers. So that was a little bit what we explored more from the product focused angle, and then from the influencer focused angle we came up with sort of this concept that basically influencer marketing to a certain extent is self-commodification. So you're actually turning yourself in a monetizing individual. You're monetizing your social network, you're monetizing yourself, and sort of we explored that interlinkage a little bit.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting because in some way this does could look like in some way, at very first glance, like a problem of it's a very ethical problem, of course, especially the monetization of individuals, of ourselves when we go online, but not just when you use influencer. When we are influencers, think about even when our expression or data are monetized by other actors, and we are not so much aware of that. Probably yes, we are aware because we study this topic today, but the most part of people probably are not so aware of that, and so this comes from an ethical concern, but becomes also a constitutional law concern, a public law concern, especially for democracy, because not only for consumer law, but also because you are not totally aware how, and this is all the debate about surveillance capitalism and so forth, how our emotions, our expressions, and ourself, even our autonomy is monetized, and also our data are processed, our data as an expression of our personal identity. So, Simone, would you like to continue?
Yes, thank you, Giovanni. So in our chapter, we focused on child influences. So we sort of shifted the perspective, because very often what is being written is about influencing children, by influencers. Influencers that influence children through their marketing messages. And so we shifted that perspective to children being influencers online, which they more and more often are, and sometimes even very, very young children, so toddlers or 4 or 5-year-olds. can be influencers, and they can either be influencers in and of themselves, so they themselves doing the influencing, which is more often teens, but also parents using them in their own influencing work because, well, children are attractive and may make their influencing work having a greater impact. So we shifted that perspective and we looked at the children's rights perspective more specifically. So how does, what from a children's rights perspective would be the issues that you would need to address? And there are basically two sides. One side is, and that's basically coming from the right of children to be protected from commercial exploitation, which in other words is mainly about child labor. And that is something that is prohibited in most legal systems, allowing children from a certain age to be engaged in work, but only light work. And then the question is child influencing? Is it light work? What even is light work? It's very often not defined. And would child influencing work fall under the provisions of child labor law? And what we've seen is that it's actually a gray area. And some of the regulators in countries are now starting to be engaged in questions to what extent this kind of work actually is covered by the law or should be covered by the law. And the other side, which we should not forget, is that children also have participation rights. And being involved in child influencing work can be very instructive. You can potentially learn a lot. You can develop a lot of skills. It's about communicating. It's about social interaction with others. It's also part of developing your identity. You could say it's learning to be engaged in entrepreneurial work. So there's also a side where you would like to provide children with a certain amount of freedom to actually participate in the digital world, also by engaging engaging also in influencer work. So you need to sort of balance those rights and find the spots where influencer work would be harmful to children, basically, because that is the point where you would start to regulate and also provide restrictions to what children are allowed or aren't allowed to do, and that might also depend on what age they are. So that's basically what we did.
Yeah, I don't know if Sophia want to jump in, but I can continue because here we have a lot of things actually to stress, because this is strongly connected to what Isabel has stressed before. So the ethical the ethical challenges, of course, concern also children, and so this is this is of course a big problem, also because the protection of minors is also a constitutional value. It's not just something that actually belongs to consumer law, but because, as you know very well, sometimes the need to protect consumers comes from the need to protect some constitutional values, and so this is actually the bridge between market and democracy. And I think that the influencer marketing actually show us this kind of bridge between what the market creates and what democracy actually requires to protect our constitutional values on the one hand, but also because if you look, for example, the recent adoption of the amendments to the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, actually there are especially some safeguards that are asked, for example, to online platforms, to video sharing platforms like YouTube, for example, to protect minors against harmful content. And so the question is whether this kind of content this kind of misleading content coming from influencer marketing, or even when minors are directly involved in influencer marketing, could in some way something that could fall within the responsibility of platforms to in some way implement some safeguards to avoid that actually minors are exposed to harmful content. So this is something that even goes beyond actually influencer marketing and concern also social media responsibilities online. And so on that, since influencers have shown to have so much in some way power over their communities, kind of another power than social media have on their communities. I think that Marika can continue on that because you have focused a little bit on how in some way influencers can shape their communities and society. So if you have, of course, I'm sure that you have something to share with us.
Okay, so we conducted interviews with teenage influencers just Simone already referred to. So it are the teenagers themselves who are influencing their communities here, and parents do have a role to play, but more like in a helpful way. They help taking pictures and so on, but it's mostly the teenagers who decide for themselves. Some also had a manager that was involved, but most of them were self-made social media influencers, and we focused on the process of becoming an influencers and the tactics they used. And we found that they don't start their social media profiles with the purpose of becoming an influencers. So they just noticed that the content that they posted was appreciated by many, and this was expressed by an increasing number of followers and likes. And therefore the option of becoming a social media influencer arose, and they also started to behave accordingly. So from that point onwards, they posted with the intention to get a lot of likes and followers. So, and the turning point for them was the rising number of followers and also being contacted by brands. Moreover, we also focused on which platforms and strategies they used for their activities. And we looked at influencer marketing as a form of consumer empowerment, and we used a theoretical model from Kusuk for this. So we focused on how technology competent they were, so how they used social media platforms to perform. Next, we also focused on their economic self-efficacy, which is their belief and confidence to put themselves into a better economic situation. So translated to influencer marketing, this was how they arranged endorsement deals and how they exercised influence over their followers. And then next we focused on their social efficacy and how they thought about them influencing their followers. And then last we focused on their legal self-efficacy, which is the most interesting part for most of you, I guess, and which is their ability to successfully reach legal information and protect their own rights as consumers on the internet. And what really came up here was the fact that they are mostly not aware of the legal terms they have to take into account, or for instance the obligations they have in making it clear that this post was sponsored. They're simply not aware, and even those who had a manager or who often cooperated with brands did not make them aware of the fact that they should disclose. And then for the last part, we focused on potential windfalls but also downfalls of being an influencer, and we found that they tended to be very positive about their influencer status, and they did not really experience major downsides, but we did recognize that it was a constant pressure. For instance, one girl said that when she traveled, she immediately looked around to see which places would be interesting to put on social media. So it's a constant pressure that they experience to post interesting content and to maintain and gain more followers. So yeah.
Can I jump in to ask one question actually to both Marijke and to Simone? Because we're talking, both of you wrote about minors. In both cases, we're talking about minors that might not be aware of the legal implications of their activities because they don't disclose the fact that they are advertising, or because basically they are working many more hours than they're actually allowed to. Because the thing is, when you're a child actor or a child model, there are so many rules that apply to you. But the thing is, just the other day I was watching a show on television, and it was about this woman who had 5 children. And because she wanted to pay the bills, she decided to actually turn her 5 children into influencers. And she said, well, I don't think it's labor because I'm just taking pictures of my daily life. And so they are just helping us pay the bills. But she didn't see this as labor. She saw this as just something fun. So I'm just asking you, I mean, this is not just something fun. So do you stretch, this is difficult, but I mean, I guess we could easily stretch this to labor. So actually I'd like to invite both Simone and Marijke to actually talk about the role of parents, not only agents, but really parents. I mean, shouldn't the parents be the ones that actually should be complying with all these rules? Because I mean, they are the ones that are behind it. I mean, teenagers are still minors. So, but I would really invite, for me, first Simone and then Mariah, to really talk about the parents behind them, especially the parents that actually get minors involved, and also like see them as a way of getting more followers.
Yes, yeah, that's a very good question, and it's not just about child labor. It's also about topics such as parenting, and which raises a lot of passionate remarks when I address them in my courses. So when I talk about those topics with my students, because it's also about privacy rights of children, which is something that you've not addressed yet. Children may not want to be in these videos or pictures, and they may be potentially embarrassing, and you may not want to be confronted with them when you get older. We know among teens, sharing information about yourself is part of developing your identity, and it's rather you make rather very specific choices about what you share and what you don't share, and sort of parents, but also grandparents, to be honest, they may interfere with those choices, and there are other risks. But getting back to the child labor part, that is also something that we addressed in our chapter. That actually there is a tension there, because it's basically parents that they are the primary responsible when it comes to protecting children. And making sure that the choices that are being made are the ones that are best for the child, so are in the best interest of the child. That is not just just a responsibility of parents, but they have the primary responsibility there. And here, parents have a stake in making their own choices and furthering their own interests, which in this case is making money of their influencing work, and their children play a role in that. And this is something that is actually a gray area when we look into child labor law, because child labor law is basically about employment relations and employment contracts, and this is a different area, because here we're talking about the private environment of the child with the parent together. That's not something that we normally see as an employment relationship. And so maybe we need to reconceptualize these kinds of situations differently in order also to maybe put restrictions on what parents can do in relation to their children, which I would immediately say is a very sensitive area, because obviously parents have a lot of autonomy in deciding about their children and what activities they develop in relation to their children. So it's a very sensitive area, and regulating that would also bring in the government, and so that may raise issues there and discussions there, and that may also be different in different countries, because there are different cultural issues also. So it raises a lot of issues, but I think it's an important topic that we need to address. And we also see, for instance, that in the Netherlands, the regulator on labor, the labor regulator, so the labor inspectorates, they're actually doing a study now into child influencing work, and also to what extent that maybe should be regulated by the law, by child labor law. So I don't have an immediate answer. It raises a lot of other questions, but I think it's an important issue.
Yes, so we said about the regulation, but I think that Marike want to add something on that, right?
So we mostly focused on teenagers, and where I do follow Simon, that is that the parents have a very important role to play, especially when the influencers are very young, our children. We saw it in the interviews with teenagers that teenage influencers act very autonomous. And it's also a process that grows. So it starts with brands sending them free products and they feel very flattered. And they also tend to believe that what brands expect from them in return is rather fair. And they also feel and believe that they can negotiate about the terms. But if we looked to what they actually received for creating all that content, the reward system seems to be very uneven. But then again, once the influencers get more professional, we had 2 influencers who had their own manager. This changes again, so then they are protected by an agency, so to say, who also get part of the fee. And then about the role of parents, we saw that they were mostly just supporting their child, but not really controlling, so to say. So the role played here by parents for starting teenage influencers was not that big, but I think it changes once they develop into child stars or child celebrities, so to say. One thing I would like to add is that I think it's too simple to put all responsibility with children and with parents. I think brands and also platforms have an important role or an important responsibility here, because in the end they also get part of the revenue. And I think that most, as far as I'm aware of all legal concerns, but especially in Belgium, it's the fact that most of the responsibilities lay with the influence parents, so to say. But I think this is just too easy, and there are multiple actors involved and multiple parties who get part of the revenue. So I think this is definitely something to take in mind.
But it is just one final thing that I think is interesting to point out is that you actually see that this is a very volatile profession where people gain followers, and you see that a lot of influencers have had psychological issues, and teenagers are particularly fragile. So shouldn't it be like an additional protection for children and teenage influencers, because they might not be able to handle the pressure as well as adult influencers do, and even adult influencers don't even handle the pressure very well, as we have seen in the news.
Yeah, maybe Marijke can say more about this, but because when we did this study, what we found was that the impact on child influences is not always very clear yet. So we have studies on what the impact of marketing and advertising is on children. And in that case, the impact is not always straightforward, but we know that it has an impact and that it also has a negative impact in certain ways. But the other way around, when we look at child influencers and doing that kind of work, I think it's very much still also uncharted territory. So I'm very happy also with the research that Marijke did into the teen influencers and the experiences that they have, because we certainly need that kind of research to also get a better idea of that impact. But yes, I think potentially it can be quite stressful to be engaged in influencing work. There's a lot of productivity is being required to stay on top of things, to make sure that you post things regularly, that it looks good, that it's interesting for people, that it's entertaining. So the pressure can potentially be quite high. Then again, what the impact is in terms of being involved in that kind of commercial work, we don't know a lot about that yet. So what is the impact of that on children? So if you look from a child rights perspective, we expect children, when it comes to education and playing, we expect them to be in non-commercial environments where they have the autonomy to engage in their own activities, to develop their own activities. And this is something different. This is an environment where a lot of things are scripted, where, they're very commercial because you're trying to sell something. You're becoming your own brand even, so that's sort of becoming your identity, this brand. So it's a very different environment based on children. I think we need to certainly find that out.
Yeah, we indeed asked for the potential downsides of being an influencer they experience, but in fact, we're only 13, of course, but the influencers we interviewed, they all tended to be very positive about their influencer status, and they did not experience major downsides, they said. But then when we asked more, they told us about getting negative reactions from strangers online that may make them insecure, but they mostly ascribe them to jealousy or they ignore them. They also experience pressure to regularly post appealing content, and they make their followers happy and to remain prominent among brands. And in the end, this might be detrimental for their school results or even their sleep or social life. So it is a constant pressure that they experience. And they also tend to compare with other more successful influencers. But they say they do this for motivational purposes and that they are mostly motivated by watching more successful influencers. So yeah, if you explicitly ask the teenagers, do you experience downsides of being an influencer? They say no, not at all. But then if you ask more some maybe negative sides of being an influencer, the constant pressure, negative reactions come forth.
And perhaps this is a good time to actually move to the next speaker, who has been doing also empirical research, and not only doing empirical research, but also assessing the methods of empirical research on influencers. Monica, you have the floor. Can you tell us something more about your chapter?
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Giovanni. So yeah, I was listening to Simona and Marika when they described their research and were mentioning all the time that there's still so much we don't know how it actually works, right? What kind of impact being a social influencer has on children, like negative but also maybe positive impacts. So Marika did really amazing work here, providing some first insights into how that actually works. In our chapter that I wrote together with Case, we give many examples of such empirical research into this new phenomenon of social media influencers. And we wrote not only about different examples of how empirical research that is, collecting data in a systematic way to provide more insights about the real world, how they can inform us about how this new phenomenon works. But we also gave examples of research that aims at evaluating the impact of possible regulations or existing regulations, but also try to give more insights about the mechanisms, what are actually the underlying forces of, let's say, people reactions to law or to regulations that can help us developing new ways and new forms of addressing these issues from the regulatory perspective. So these are different examples of how empirical research can inform us about the new phenomenon, but also inform regulators about how to regulate these and whether it's actually necessary to regulate the new phenomenon. But we also wrote about how to assess the validity and reliability of this type of research. And of course, there are some traditional issues that we face with all empirical research, not only with regard to social media influencers, such as can we draw causal inferences from empirical research? We need a very specific research design in order to be able to say that regulation, for instance, has an impact on behavior to draw causal inferences. But we also need a special empirical design in order to be able to say that what we observe in our research can be generalized to a broader population that is of interest to us. But with regard to empirical research on social media influencers, there are also some new challenges when it comes to conducting empirical studies on that. Such as collection of data online. On the one hand, there is so much data online, right? So social media influencers are producing that. So it's amazing that we can just, access it. It's there, it's online, right? So we not always need to conduct interviews as Marike, but we can just go online and just, collect what is out there. But at the same time, the amount of this data calls for new approaches. So how to collect it? Definitely not manually if there are so many data of this type, right? So this poses also additional challenges. And related to that are issues of like ethical issues from the research perspective. So can you actually collect this data? Does it interfere with privacy of people who are posting this data and uploading them online? Do we need consent of people who we are researching and who are like posting this content online in order to, investigate their behavior? Because they will in the end be involved in an empirical study. So in principle, they would need to consent to. So it raises a lot of that are important to evaluate, maybe not only like validity and what kind of conclusions we can make from empirical research, but also kind of like ethical issues involved in doing empirical research on social media influencers. So that's like in short what the chapter is about.
Yeah, this sounds amazing because we have put so much actually things on the table. We said so much about, we have provided a lot of food of thoughts about that. But what has actually, at least in my very humble opinion, what has really emerged from what we said so far is that there is that there are at least two things. The first of all is that we don't know actually, we don't know still so much about what is happening in this kind of industry. So we have a lot of questions, and so of course, since there is this kind of asymmetry, sometimes it's also difficult, as Monica stressed, to find the right approach to study this phenomenon or this phenomena in general. So of course this is a first challenge, but of course this is a first challenge for research in general, The second point is how, and this is actually the focus, actually, especially of this episode in some way, is that how to, in some way, ensure that those kind of public values that has emerged so far, so that we discussed, so the protection of minors, the need to protect our autonomy when we surf the web, when we are exposed to this kind of content. So this is very interesting because these are not only questions that involves contracts or private law issues, but concern actually our daily life. And so what is particularly important, and I would like also to try to move a little bit the discussion on that with you from different perspective, from your perspective, is what is your idea on the intersection between the power of influencers, of course, to shape their communities, to influence their communities, and to create new kind of boundaries and also bundles between people online. But also, what about the moderation of social media, of influencer marketing content by social media? Because it is true that, of course, influencer marketing has an incredible power over community and consumers. But what about the logic that social media platforms apply when they moderate influencer content? Because this kind of, in a way, we can say that we have two forms of monetization. We have the monetization of the platform with the content of the influencer, and then we have the mediated, in some way, monetization of the influencer through their content. So in this kind of, let's say, mix between this first form of moderation by the platform and let's say the moderation of content, the exposition, the creation of content by influencer marketing. So what is, in your opinion, the idea about the ethical concern when we frame the focus and the topic of influencer marketing within the framework of social media? Because, of course, when we look at the topic of influencer marketing, we can stress what are the challenges, but we should not forget that this kind of phenomenon occurs, and especially we can observe actually the phenomenon within the social media framework. Probably if we do not have social media, we will not be here discussing about, social media influencer marketing. You know what? So in this kind, what are, in your opinions, and this is interesting, the idea to a better cooperation of a new kind of framework of governance in the framework that connects platforms and influencer marketing. Because in my opinion, what we are dealing so far, the guarantees disclosing, is not just about influencers but also about social media, what kind of safeguards and also tools social media provide to influencer in order to disclose, to inform the public and so forth. So anyone want to start on that? Yes, Isabel, please. Yes, please.
Yeah, I want to add another layer of complication, perhaps, and we also stressed this in our article. I totally agree that ultimately, of course, you have the very influencer and you have the platform, but I think I'm very skeptical about the fact that I think, let's say, a cosmetic influencer has a very sound understanding how data analytics work, and that, I mean, let's say I'm very skeptical to the fact that the majority of individuals who are sort of small and medium-sized influencers in terms of their reach know exactly how their agency, but also the platform, can calculate how much exposure their post had, and sort of what are sort of their how their posts are being actually targeted towards the user segments that are the most likely to then, as a result, purchase the product. So I think we sort of leaving out the power of the agency in the equation, and that's in general when talking about platform regulation, it's sort of a trend. We also never talk about regulating data brokers. Hopefully this conversation is sort of intensifying, but I just think we really have to look at the agencies a bit more closely in terms of how they collect the data about the exposure of influencer postings, and how they're sort of analyzing that data. Because on top of the sort of connection between the influencer and the person watching the content, sort of this emotional micro manipulation, you've got this whole chain of bad practice when third parties are actually involved in this whole data collection and analysis, which gets to a super technical level, and I think they're even shifting all the blame to the child influencer, the teenage influencer, or even the parent is putting so much burden on them that it's not really appropriate, because this whole back machine that is invisible is not taken into account. That would be my opinion, but I'm happy to hear others.
Anyone else want to jump in? Because here, yes, Monica, please go ahead.
Just very shortly, I mean, again, like shows how many empirical questions we have regarding the subject. So, starting with the involvement of platforms themselves in the process, right? So what Giovanni was mentioning at the beginning about like the moderation of the content and monetization of the content. I mean, learning how much they moderate it. We don't know that, right? We do see some anecdotal, maybe we do, hear about some anecdotal evidence about that, but do we know how widespread this phenomenon is and how it is actually conducted? That's, again, an empirical question. What Isabel was mentioning about how the third parties, like the brokers, right, the managers work, we also don't know so much about that, right? So it would be also worth exploring how much influence, how much impact these agents actually have on all the other actors involved, right? So just wanted to stress again, like the importance of empirical research on that, because we can talk about anecdotal evidence, but it would be just from, like probably the most known cases, right? What we know about it. But is it really widespread? Is it really like general? Can we really generalize from this anecdotal evidence to like the whole world of social media influencers and platforms? We don't know, right?
I think something that we could also ask in this context that would also call for more empirical evidence is also how the algorithms that are used by social media platforms actually play a role in this, because we don't know exactly what kind of content becomes viral, and that is essential. I mean, some people say, well, just the hashtags, some types of content are more likely to score better with some platforms than others. But the thing is, this is essential. If you make a living out of this content, you really want to know how you can actually boost your views. And that is also something that has to do with the functioning of platforms, but this is something that is also quite opaque still. I don't know if we actually can reach like a conclusion here, because this is actually, as Monica said, something that really requires quite a lot of empirical evidence. But I think this brings us to the problem of power. I mean, who has here power, and what are we talking about? I mean, as Isabel has raised, it's not only about the power shift from parents to children, or children to parents. It's also about understanding the power dynamics, and I think it's important to also bring in the question of ethics. And that's why something that I really think it's important here is that we should talk more about companies and about the ethics of companies, because I know that, for example, and this is just anecdotal evidence, when I look into influencers, I see that many influencers want to brand themselves as ethical influencers, and that they only go with certain brands because I think they're ethical brands. But this is also something that is not, we haven't really scratched the surface of this. This is my feeling as an amateur in this area. So perhaps I can invite Isabel and Marijke to jump in and talk more about ethics when it comes to, and also like the branding of companies, and how this also is reshaping the discussion when it comes to influencers.
Marijke, do you want to start?
Maybe you can start with this attempt to connect, the ethics of companies, because you have this influencers. I believe you even discussed in the chapter that pride themselves in being, and they brand themselves as being more ethical than others, because they only go with sustainable brands. For example, they don't accept paint from multinationals that are that buy farmers that are not well paid, this kind of thing. So I was hoping to discuss more in the direction.
Yeah, I also notice this trend, but also from my gut feeling, from my own experience. But one thing that we found from the interviews is that sometimes a tension exists between being loyal to the brand, because in fact they are paid by the brand and they want to be loyal to their employer, so to say. But on the other hand, they want to remain fair towards their followers. So sometimes it happens that they are not that satisfied with the product they received, or they are being paid for to promote, and then this tension arises, and they actually try to circumvent this by using strategies. For instance, like posting it on their Instagram stories, because the content disappears after 24 hours. So this way they try to circumvent it, and they hope that it disappears quickly, or they make deals that they can delete the content after a certain period of time, because they also don't want to be too commercial. But this tension does arise. So where influencer marketing is mostly experienced by followers as something more genuine, or fair than other marketing practices. In fact, this tension arises, and they want to be loyal towards the brands they are cooperating with. So there's questions here. And I also think from a brand perspective that most brands now say that if you're promoting this brand, you cannot promote another brand. For instance, if you promote Coca-Cola, you cannot cooperate with other soda brands, for instance. But yeah, I also noticed the trend of only wanting to support more ethical brands, but this is not something we found from the interviews. So is that a question, an answer to your question, or?
Yeah, it is for sure. I think you explained it very well. Isabel, would you like to add anything to Marijke's views?
Yeah, I think what is interesting to see is some brands or influencers, or also on a larger scale, some of the bigger, like the market leaders in certain fields, are trying to promote themselves as being an ethical company, but nobody has an idea what is an ethical company. Like there's a lot of certification indices and so forth, where you sort of try to come up with a standard. But I can just say I've worked in this field for a long time, and not even in the field of human rights. A lot of companies are able to promote proper conduct when you're actually looking at their practices. So to a certain extent, it would be interesting to see whether in empirical research, the sort of window dressing, as in the influencers coming up with certain slogans, whether that actually translates into the practices, how they're selecting the products that they're endorsing, and how they're promoting their content, how genuinely transparent they are about sort of the normative standards they want to hold themselves account to. So yeah, it's nice to see that movement, but still, if it's just sort of a greenwashing, whitewashing, or whatsoever exercise, it's not worth it.
And do you think we should regulate this? Do you think there should be more regulation when it comes to protection of business ethics?
Well, I mean, the thing with ethics is it's not necessarily inherently only a legal question, but it's really about also changing management practices. So, and there's always a gray zone between the law and the actual corporate management practices. But there's certainly some things that would really, really help, and that have been also introduced already. I mean, if you're thinking, how do we differentiate between a friend who is promoting content to you, or how do you then see that this is clearly a post where that individual is making money with? And I think sort of this labeling of content that is proper advertising and where the person actually is making money from, that has already been an improvement, so that when I don't know, teenagers or people who are not so well aware of the structures of I don't know, Instagram and so forth, at least can sort of detect automatically this is sponsored content. So it has been introduced already, and I think this is quite a good step from my perspective.
Giovanni, would like to continue?
Yeah, of course. No, we have, let's say, the last 15 minutes, so I would like just to focus on, we can say, a last macro point that I think is about in some way how to address this phenomenon. This phenomenon also through regulation, even if of course we have stressed that of course we need more data to talk about regulation. But for the first time I would like to ask you and would like to talk with you whether you think that maybe it's better or it would be suitable to regulate the relationship between influencers and platforms rather than to regulate the relationship between influencers and consumers. Because when we address the regulation of influencers and consumers, indirectly we are addressing the regulation of speech. Because if we say, or if we bound your speech with more safeguards, or with some censoring measures for some content that are not disclosed, for example, this is very much problematic from a constitutional law perspective, for example, because that kind of regulation should pass through scrutiny, because it should be proportionate. So, but what about if we move from the framework of B2C to the framework of B2B? What about regulating transparency between platforms and influencers? Also because, and this also I would like to hear from Simone, for example, also about children, because regulating and requiring platforms in some way to be more transparent in their relationship with influencers, for example creating, I don't know, for example a space where influencers should accept some conditions and so forth, could provide more safeguards. And also because sometimes it happens, and this is another big problem of influencer marketing, that sometimes influencers, not of course children, but usually other influencers, they usually rely on, for example, YouTube or even other social media to run their business, actually to run their business. And sometimes their monthly income come from YouTube, for example. And what happens when, for example, YouTube decide autonomously to block their account or remove their content? What about the damage these actors suffer? But this is not just, and this is once again the connection between the content moderation platforms and influencer marketing, because this does not just concern a reputational or pecuniary damage. This also concerns the moderation of speech. Think also about when influencers goes, for example, and talk about topics touching political content. For example, elections, you know, sometimes it happens so much time. There are a lot of influencers that talks about politics and or topics in the public debate. So the topic is that rather than regulating speech, you know, when we want to address influencers marketing, why don't we focus on the regulation of transparency between platforms and influencers? So the floor is of all of yours, actually.
Actually, maybe I can even invite Simona to reflect on one aspect because it's something that Simona also addressed in one of her interventions today. I think the problem that Giovanni is bringing into the discussion is that law is by nature bilateral. It's usually about the relationship between an employer and an employee. And now with social influencer marketing, you don't have just a bilateral relationship. You have a triangular relationship. And law doesn't like the triangular relationships in
No.
general. Law is always about bilateral. I mean, even in competition law, you have the habitable cartel that can be applied, but rarely does one apply it. And you have here, of course, we have mechanisms to apply triangle, but it's difficult. So perhaps it's what I would like to invite you to whether we can actually talk more about this triangular, multilateral relationships when it comes to child labor, when it comes to the protection of children's rights, because I think it's important to look at this third party, the platform, when we discuss influencer work, because it might be difficult, as you have mentioned before, to actually define the rights of these children when we don't really know who we are regulating.
Yes, I think there's many issues now sort of brought together. So we've just been talking about the algorithms doing their work and showing some kinds of content and maybe not others, or prioritizing content. You might say that that is part of a larger debate, not just about influencers, but also about showing, conspiracy theories, about extremist content, about disinformation. So I think that is, and the algorithms also changing all the times, to make the system more effective or more efficient, but also to address these concerns. So you can't just focus on influencing work then, because there is a much broader debate about the way information is being shown and what the impact is on citizens more generally, not just children. Although I think children should be a category in and of themselves because of their vulnerability. But basically what we see is that a lot of the debate about regulation is because, there is a lot of issues that are complicated and also complex, I should say. The focus is not very often directly on children. So children are even more, making things even more complicated, and that's also the reason why children are mostly actually excluded from these platforms. So basically, these platforms don't need to focus on children, or at least children from under a certain age. So, for instance, YouTube says, children under 13 years old are banned from the platform. Other platforms also use the age of 16. So children are not seen as part of the citizenry of these platforms, because they're being excluded, and they're being excluded because it's difficult to have them because of safety issues. So that is another difficulty to actually address these issues. So, and then the question is, what is the problem that you actually want to solve? So some of these problems, when it comes to transparency and disclosing whether certain content is commercial content, they're mostly regulated by consumer law. And then the focus is on the influencers themselves to show that this content is being communicated. And we also see in self-regulation that, for instance, influencers are making codes of conduct to actually very often these rules are not always in laws themselves. They're very often also part of self-regulation. And the same is true for businesses. So a lot of marketing laws or marketing regulation is basically industry regulation. So, well, as you can hear from what I'm saying, so a lot of this is fragmented over different legal areas, over different laws, and sometimes we don't even know whether these laws apply to new activities. So basically, what I'm saying is, what is the problem that we're solving, and what would be the best way of doing it, and what would be the legal area that we need to do it in? Is it consumer law? Is it competition law? Was also being mentioned. Are we talking about regulating content as such, which can be a much broader issue? And then we need to look at what would be the best, what would be the persons or the organizations we need to address, who can solve these problems. And I think the answer is not the same for all these kinds of issues. But I do agree that platforms need to take responsibility here as well. It's just that the way we need to do that, the question is what would we need to focus on primarily now?
Jeroen, go ahead. Jeroen, I'll introduce Jeroen. Jeroen is one of my master students at the University of Groningen. I think he's almost finished with his master. He had a question, a very interesting question. Go ahead, Jeroen.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. My main concern is about influencers selling products that have certain medical claims, like essential oils, also goop with Goop Ultra. Have you guys also, or do you have any research done in that particular sector? Because you see it not only just on YouTube, but mainly on Facebook, large Facebook groups that are selling those essential oils, and they're saying that it can cure certain skin diseases, but also even more harmful, that it can cure certain kinds of cancer. So, I also asked in the chat, but is there any research about influencers that are selling those medical products, and are there governments that want to regulate that sector? Because if I want to buy something at a pharmacy, then it's all regulated, all by the government. You have a Ministry of Health, all just regulates what can be sold, it can't be sold. So how does it work on the internet?
I don't know if Simone, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert in this area, but I know that recently platforms that are selling these, for instance, essential oils are a very good example, that are actually selling this and making those claims, have been contacted, and they've actually also removed these kinds of contents. So that was something that I recently saw in the media. So it might be a case of regulators, so supervisory authorities actually contacting these platforms, and apparently they do remove it when they've been when they've been contacted and pointed out that this is something that might actually be harmful to people buying it, and that the claims that they're making have not been are not being evidenced by scientific research as in terms of being true. But again, this is more like a piecemeal approach. It's not a comprehensive regulatory approach towards these issues. And I'm not sure, to be honest, what Facebook or YouTube would do, because it's also part of it's part of free speech, and there enormously very reluctant to move content. We see them moving a bit more, maybe Twitter a bit more than Facebook at the moment. But that is particular content. It's extremist content. It's about conspiracy theories. It has a lot to do with the current COVID-19 crisis and harms being made to people, but also to democracies. But that's different kind of content than the one, than the medical content that you're just focusing on. So they might be reluctant to remove it. But some platforms apparently do.
And also, I think that this problem, like for example, but also health device or health products, related products, could also in some way also link to the issue of disinformation. Because in some way, sometimes this content can also be shared just to engage with users, to go viral, even without relying on whether that kind of information about health or health information are true or not. Not because it's a meta search for the truth, but also because there are regulation in every member state about with a focus on Europe about the advertising of health device and health products. So I do not see actually why, for example, an influencer should not comply with that, for example, in some way. The problem still, and this is a problem of consumer law, is that in some way the boundaries is still distinguishing between me, for example, as a person, and me as a business, Because the idea is that a lot of influencers actually monetize from what they said, and actually they can in some way consider as business actors rather than users, actually. And so if you are a business actor and you advertise the products, for example, without the authorization of the Ministry of Health of one member state, just an example, okay? For example, you are just, of course, violating a rule, just violating a legal a norm. So in some way, of course, I would say that some rules applies to the digital environment in this case, but the problem is that still there are gray lines between when influencers are consumers and when they are business. And then, of course, the role, as Simone stressed, let's say the mediation and the role of influencer marketing, of social media is critical, because of course when we want to address these things on social media, you need to in some way overcome the threshold for regulating free speech. And so this is a problem, not only for regulating free speech, but also because, as once again Simone stressed before, the problem is also that platforms, especially because they come from a US environment, they are reluctant to address free speech issues, Also because the First Amendment in the US is also actually the legal basis, the shield on which social media relies to conduct their business. So it would be just to use the same actually shield that they use to perform their business as a weapons against themselves. So there are a lot of institutional, constitutional, and also other issues in this framework that are very complicated. But we are almost at the end of our episode because it's almost 4:15. So I know probably Sophia has anything to say now at the very end.
Actually, I just wanted to close this question, but this is a really interesting question because we have someone in the audience, so as our audience, who's actually an expert in this field, Mason Marks. I will put you on the spotlight because I know you do quite a lot of work on health law, and you actually study medicine. You're a doctor, if I'm not mistaken. So perhaps you can tell us what your thoughts are in this regarding this situation.
Yeah, thank you. I really like this topic of medical information. And last year, Facebook did come out with a policy where they said they would censor health-related speech that could be harmful or misleading. So they're actually making these decisions now. And I think it cuts the other way. So when they are censoring health-related speech, they're not just censoring potentially harmful information, but also information that could be useful from a public health perspective. So people might be talking about a certain drug and reporting a negative side effect or maybe a positive side effect. And a lot of platforms like YouTube or Facebook, they will censor your content just for mentioning certain categories of drugs, even drugs that aren't regulated. In the US, there's a plant called kratom, which is not regulated, but a lot of platforms will censor your speech. And then one thing I wanted to bring up regarding content moderation, something I've thought about a bit is the censorship of certain populations by social media platforms. So Facebook censors some people with disabilities just for bringing up their disability, whether it's bipolar or personality disorders. Those people, they may not be completely censored, but the algorithms treat them differently. So they won't end up on the front page, or they won't end up on a trending page. And so those people actually, those entire populations might not be able to become influencers because they belong to those groups. And so they can't monetize their posts. And so that's just a really interesting angle that I'm particularly interested in. And thanks for this great conversation. It's a great topic.
Thank you. And I think that just to conclude the answer to Jeroen's question, I think this is definitely something that needs to be further researched, because I know that in Europe and in the US, many authorities have been trying to notify influencers regarding the kind of advice they give. In that sense, I think it is important to have more empirical research on exactly what's going on and what kind of advice is being given. So I think, as Giovanni said, we are approaching the end of our session. So perhaps we can invite anyone who would like to conclude the talk show, or little talk show on influencers, with a couple of final remarks. For example, what's next? Are you doing any kind of interesting research on influencers that you'd like to share with us, with our viewers in the future? What should we do? What lies ahead still? Because I think this is a really a research topic that we need to actually bring out the attention of the funding institutions, because I really think that not all funding institutions are aware of the importance of the topic. Luckily, Catalina and I, we actually got a grant for this project, so in essence, we are very grateful to the Independent Research Science Foundation, because they actually saw the potential in the topic. But we know that it is important to show that this is not just something for kids to follow. This is something that refers to millions of people all around the world, and it has important illegal implications. I don't see any hands in the air, so Giovanni, would you like to? Oh, Isabel, go ahead.
Yeah, my co-author was actually so inspired by our paper, by our chapter, that she wants to extend the thinking on sort of the commodification, and combine it with some thoughts around recognition theory. So sort of what sort of activities in society people get recognition for. So that's like a theory that comes from sort of workplace human resource management studies, and what we want to do then as a next step is sort of use that model and apply it to influencer marketing, and sort of how the self-commodification changes the basically the section between the private and the public life, and sort of how recognition plays into that. So yeah, we'll be working on that in the coming months.
Yes, please, Simone.
Yeah, just very quickly, because when I started, I said, well, a lot of the work that we did on this chapter came from sort of conceptualizing, or in a certain way also reconceptualizing the right of children to protection from commercial exploitation. And like I said, part of that is also about child labor. What I find very interesting now, and well, that's something that we're engaged in at the moment, is also to reconceptualize it more in terms, and that's new, in terms of online manipulation, dark patterns. It's something that's been mentioned before in this talk show. Using we mentioned it in kind of a combination with the algorithms that sort of influence you, or that show you certain kind of content or not. But it's obviously much broader than this. It's something that is part of almost any commercial environment online now, in terms of the loot boxes that we have seen, but also being sort of pushed into buying something in order to go forward in a game. So there's all kinds of latent that could potentially be conceptualized as commercial exploitation. And then the question is, to what extent is that something that we find undesirable or maybe even unfair or unethical, especially in relation to children being a vulnerable group? And that is, I think, an area that still needs a lot of work. It's very much a gray area. There is some laws and regulations that address it, but it's very fragmented, and a lot of these laws have these gray areas where we're actually not sure yet whether it's regulated and what it means when it is. So we've actually moved on, more into these questions of commercial exploitation. And this chapter has been, addressing one of them. But I think there is a whole area that still needs to be explored, and also areas. I mean, we're doing the legal research, but I think there's also a lot of potentially very interesting questions for empirical research in those areas. And thank you very much for organizing this. I'm not sure this is my last time I can say something, so thanks for that. It's been great to be part of this.
Thank you for being with us. And Monica, perhaps on the empirical part, what would you expect authorities to research when it comes to empirical data? What kind of data do we need to see gathered, and what kind of research do we still need to have in order to actually understand better this phenomenon?
I mean, I would say all kind of data. Basically, from qualitative data such as research presented by Monica, where we go more in depth and try to explore the phenomenon, but also quantitative data that will give us more information about the whole population of social media influencers and how they work, how they behave, and what kind of impact they have on the audience. But also, what I think is also really important to keep in mind is the kind of the imbalance that we have between the amount of data that platforms have and the knowledge that they have about what works and how it works and how it impacts people, and the amount of information knowledge that we have, like kind of on the other side. So I think what would be really important here would be to maybe try to achieve more balance between what we know as researchers or potential people who are giving information to regulators, and what platforms know about what works and what doesn't work. So I mean, going this direction, trying to put more balance between our knowledge and their knowledge would be really, really great here. So kind of like a golden goal. And also, I would like to thank you for organizing this event and for starting the idea of having this book. It's really important.
So thanks, Monica. And I think maybe it's time to, we are actually at the end of this episode, and I think that I can express also my gratitude to all of you, with Sophia also. And I think it has been a good discussion, and especially for building new paths of research on this topic, because we have in some way there are contribution in this field, but we have actually highlighted a lot of issues that still need some answers. So this actually was the aim of this second episode. So what to say at the very end? So thank you so much to be here. It has been a great opportunity to discuss this topic. And so the idea is, of course, to create this kind of networks working on this topic. And of course, we will let you know about next steps or about next episodes on influencer marketing, but in general about the field of law and technology in Europe. But anyway, so thanks again. I think that also Sophia wants to thank everyone, but it has been great, definitely. And so thanks once again, and have a nice, I think that all of you are in Europe, so have a nice actually afternoon and almost evening now. Okay?
And thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Bye.
Bye bye.